So once again, it's more complicated because we're all so different. We're all individuals and we all have different personalities. And I look at the generational descriptors, if you want to call them that, or categories, as just one part of the whole, but a part that can be important when we're looking for ways to connect with people.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. Every 15 to 20 years, we get a new generation entering the workforce. And very quickly, the older generations begin to roll their eyes at them. And maybe that's simply because the young folks think they know it all, or maybe us old farts feel threatened by the kids, or maybe there's something else to it. Joining me today is Shawn Johnson, author of this handy little guide, Strategies for Generational Inclusion at Work, 68 Proven Solutions to Increase Productivity, Innovation, and Productivity, or Profitability, even more. Shawn is a speaker, author, and consultant who's worked with leaders from small, privately owned companies to Fortune 1000 firms. She's passionate about working with leaders and their teams to foster generational inclusion using her own experience growing up in a 4-generation family business. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Shawn.
Thank you, Mike. I'm so happy to be here. I love that discussion about the older generations rolling their eyes at the younger generations. It's timeless. I mean, Aristotle referred to this, over 2,000 years ago, that this was a problem. Continues to be an issue today. And me being from an older generation, I find myself doing that occasionally. I have to check myself because we were all young once, and if things go well, we all are going to be older at some point in time. So it's that building of respect and understanding and things like that's really my goal when I go into organizations or give keynotes, is to see put ourselves in the other generation's shoes. Let's say it that way, that empathy, because we're all going through these life stages. It's just the way it goes.
Yeah, and I'm Gen X, and I'm on the leading edge of Gen X, and there were a lot of things said about us in the late 80s, and predictions about what the world was going to look like under Gen X, and according to a lot of those theories from way back then, I should still be sitting on the couch eating pizza, watching MTV all day. So I get, and as a career HR guy, I'm always nervous whenever we make broad generalizations about groups of people based on their demographics. I mean, everybody's genetics, family background, their experiences are all different. And we wouldn't make generalizations about people because of their race, their sex, their national origin. So make the argument for me that there's value in looking into and understanding generational differences.
Well, I think there's absolutely value. And let me start with my growing up experience. That seems like a good place. My grandma that I grew up with on the same farm and my grandpa, they were children of the Great Depression. And they had some crazy habits that just made me roll my eyes. Like my grandma had a walk-in closet full of toilet paper. I kid you not. And, during COVID, I wished I had that. I was like, where is that closet?
Yeah.
Let's get to it.
The future generations may have those, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But, it was so hard for me to understand the way she thought about things because I grew up in the 60s where, things are pretty easily available. I would have never thought twice about, are we going to run out of something like she did? And then you can fast forward that. Well, you mentioned Gen X. I'm kind of a tail end baby boomer, and baby boomers see things differently oftentimes than Gen Xers because we tended to have more stay-at-home moms. We didn't have as much cable television like MTV. We didn't tend to go to school with computers even in college. So we learned all those skills like computers and emails and things like that during our working career instead of during our education. So we see things a little bit differently. We might be a little more hesitant sometimes with technology because of that. And then you get to like the millennials, and you can almost divide that generation in half because the ones that grew up with eye technology think about work in different ways than those that grew up without it. So the older millennials grew up with like AOL online,
Right.
and the younger millennials grew up with iPhones. And so they think about work and technology different, even though all of those generations, from the baby boomers down to Gen Z, can be tech savvy. We can use technology. My husband is very proficient using his iPhone to do anything, but we tend to see it a little bit different. We tend to value technology in different ways.
So those are differences. And there may be listeners who are people leaders out there who say, I really don't care about what those differences are. I just want to set the expectations that this is how we're going to operate. You've got to operate at this level. You figure it out. What would you say to that leader that just says, look, I'm not keeping up with all these generational things. I'm just going to set expectations and expect people to meet them.
Yeah, well, setting expectations is definitely the number one thing. And oftentimes leaders forget to do that because, especially if we're a little older, we assume that people know what we think.
Right.
We say work starts at 8 o'clock. We think they're going to show up at 8 o'clock, and we don't set those expectations. But then to take it a step further and answer your question, once you set expectations, younger generations, because of parenting styles, are going to expect you to give more of a why. And that might be really annoying, especially for baby boomers like myself that grew up with the you do it because I said so attitude, not only parenting, but leadership, as we came into the workplace. But it's just not going to work with millennials and Gen Z because they grew up in an atmosphere where both teachers and parents said, oh, let me explain why to you. Let me tell you why. Are you going to buy into this with me? I mean, I remember having conversations with our millennial children where I was like trying to sell them on the idea that they should do something that my parents would have just said, you do it. You
Right.
do it or else. But the smaller families, that millennials and Gen Z grew up in, and the helicopter parenting styles, myself included, have led them to say, you have to explain to us why we need to do this. And it's also led to a situation where expectations need to be set more often through the years. You can't just set them once.
And so, and we still have this workforce that still has boomers in it and all the way down to Gen Z, I guess the argument would be that if we want people to know how to work alongside each other, we want leaders to know how to motivate, incentivize, and even direct and give the right kind of information to an employee. Because I'm Gen Z, and I don't know that this is necessarily a Gen Z thing, but I've always been very much just give it to me. I'll figure it out. Let me just, grind it out. And I've definitely seen that, especially with my millennials and my Gen Z employees on my team, and it may be a factor of how we hire too, for certain personality traits, I guess, but they really want to not only know the why, they want all the ambiguity removed.
Yes.
And for me, I thrive in ambiguity. And so, and I don't know how much of it is personalities for, our hiring practices, and that's worked really well for us, or if that is a generational thing. But I guess at least understanding these broad things about generations as we begin to deal with individuals on an individual basis, it's not fair to make an assumption, I guess, that a Gen Z person needs all this information. There are Gen Z people out there who don't need that constant praise and feedback and all that. But understanding that somebody, who grew up with a certain set of experiences, economically and what went on in politics in the world and just the social changes may have a higher tendency to think a certain way or to respond a certain way, may give a sensitivity when we're talking to them or working with issues around workplace issues?
Yeah, I think it's all about conversation and curiosity, asking open-ended questions, because there's life stage issues, like you mentioned in your introduction. There's life stage issues. As we get older, we do things differently. And then there's also personality. Sometimes I'll be working with a group of leaders in leadership development, and they'll say, the older people that we're trying to lead, they just don't like change. And while there is some truth in that, I find as I get older, I might be a little more resistant to change. There's also personality types. I do a lot of work with the DISC
Hmm.
assessment and the
High
people that are
D, high
high.
I, low S, low C. That's me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So the high S's, they don't like change.
Right.
So you and I are good with change,
Yeah.
and so to speak. Like, we're going to accept it more willingly, but you might have a 25-year-old with a high S that is very resistant to change of any kind. So once again, it's more complicated because we're all so different. We're all individuals and we all have different personalities. And I look at the generational descriptors, if you want to call them that, or categories, as just one part of the whole, but a part that can be important when we're looking for ways to connect with people, because it describes the problems that people share that come of age in a certain way. For example, if you're Gen Z and you went to high school or college during the pandemic, you may not have had a graduation, right? Not
Right.
one in person. You may have started work without ever meeting your fellow employees for 2 years. Those are things that you experience that other people won't. So the rest of your life, if you refer back to that with a group of people like yourself, they're going to immediately connect with what that experience was like. Whereas for the rest of us, we can't quite, we can understand it logically, but we can't connect with that. So we share the same problems with the people we grow up with. And even neuroscience, Dr. Carolyn Leaf is her name. She's actually a Texan, but she's done a lot of work in this area. And she says that the ideas we focus on, the things we focus on during our formative years, will influence our thinking the rest of our lives.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think we know just from DISC and other behavioral stuff, that age 13 to 15, kind of what you're short of a really traumatic experience. That's kind of who you are for a big part of that's who your natural behavior is going to be, at least for the rest of your life. So let's just, for clarity, we've talked about these generations. What are the age groups when you're talking about these categories, all the way, back to the traditionalists or the boomers? What years are we talking about for each of those? Just so we're all on the same page, because it seems like every time you look
Sure.
it up on the internet, it's a different kind of category.
Yeah, well, I tend to refer to the Pew Research age categories. Although recently, I think last year, they came out and said they weren't going to do that anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
they're still out there. And so I think of traditionalists as being anyone over 80. And a lot of times people are caught off guard when I say they're still at work. My
Mm-hmm.
aunt's 81. She's a school psychologist. So right in my family, I have that. And you can take a look at Congress for even
Oh
further
my gosh. Yeah.
support of
Yeah.
traditionalists being at work. And so
Well, they're
boomers,
showing up at least. I don't know if
they're
Congress is really
showing up.
working, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we could debate that, right?
Yeah.
So baby boomers, of course, are behind that. So the oldest baby boomers are about 79. The youngest baby boomers are 60, 61. And then we have Gen X. And so Gen Xers are going to be about 45 to 60, somewhere in that age range. And you see that we have these cuspers, in every group.
Mm-hmm.
So like you and I are both probably cuspers, and we might lean one way or another. We might be a blend, of the ideology of the generations. Like you might have some boomer ideology along with your Gen X. That's why it's so complicated. It's kind of slippery, right?
And I'm probably unique in that my grandparents had giant impact on me growing up.
Yeah.
And so they were traditionalists. They were definitely children of the Depression, World War II, and all of that. And there are times where I do things and I realize, oh, that was my grandfather speaking when I said that. And
Yeah.
so, I guess, the different influences people have make a difference there too. So Gen X is what, about 65 to 1980? Is that about right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because 1980 is the beginning of the millennials, 1981, because they came of age at the time of the millennium.
Okay.
2000, Y2K.
Okay.
That's when they were, really the oldest ones were entering the world of work. And then, of course, Gen Z follows them. So about 97 through 2015. And we call the youngest generation Alpha. And starting this year, we have betas being born.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative. bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. Today, Thursday, March 20th, I'm hosting a webinar entitled Alt Control Delete, Protecting Yourself from Remote Employee Fraud. While many employers recognize the advantages of remote work in attracting and retaining employees, most are unaware, much less protected from, the risk of illegal activity and fraud unique to the remote environment. Foreign actors like North Korea, fraudulent employment verifiers, and dishonest overemployed workers are but a few of the sources of liability, data breaches, and financial losses employers have suffered. Using traditional deception methods and modern artificial intelligence tools like deepfakes, bad actors are targeting unsuspecting employers. In this 1-hour webinar, I will discuss some of the ways that dishonest actors have harmed employers and practical steps employers can take to protect themselves. And just like this podcast, the webinar is free and pre-approved for recertification credit. You can register or watch the recording later by clicking on the Education tab at imperativeinfo.com, where you can also find all my previously recorded webinars. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 192 and enter the keyword Generations. That's GENERATIONS. And now back to my conversation with Shawn Johnson. So, what are those, as we talk about these different generations, especially in the workforce, what are the primary factors that shape those generational differences? We've talked on it a little bit. We just mentioned social or politics, but what are the things that really make a difference in how people, as they come of age, see the world?
Well, experts tend to believe and agree on the fact that parenting is the biggest factor. And I would say parenting influences the way we look at leadership the most of all of the things that we grow up with, parenting and education, because those are our leaders as we come of age. We might have faith-based leaders, but that's where we get our information. And you see traditionalists, I'm going to reach back to that generation because they thought of leaders as the authority. When you were watching the news during the years that they were growing up and even afterwards, whatever Walter Cronkite said, that was pretty much it. And he would say, that's the way it is when he'd close his news broadcast. And then we see the baby boomers come in, they're a little more skeptical, Vietnam, things like that. And so you see leadership shifting with world events in that way, because then you have Gen X and Watergate and all kinds of, corporate bankruptcies and corruption and people losing their jobs who should not have lost their jobs. And so there's more and more skepticism. News becomes more and more questionable, right? We start having investigative reporting, things like that. And then alongside of that, we have the parenting trends of, the mother being home, the authoritative parenting. Boomers grew up in a very competitive environment because the parents had 4 or 5 kids. So the focus wasn't just on you. And then, like I mentioned, as we go forward, Gen X, parents are busier, dual income households, and millennials. It's almost like a flip back, where parents all of a sudden are very involved. They go to every sporting event. They only have 2 kids, very focused on, are you in the right pre-K? Are you going to the right college? Or whatever the case might be. And then Gen Z, who tend to be raised by Gen Xers, it's a little different because Gen Xers tend to be a little more hands-off than millennial parents were. So all of that, does that make sense? That all comes together. It's kind of world events and parenting and education side by side, molding the way that we look at leadership, look at what should happen at work.
And so you said Gen Z is at age 7 to 25. Which only a small portion of that group has come into the workforce. And I think about that later group, that were born 2005 to 2015, the last half of that, they've seen a lot of change in their formative years, and they're not even in the workforce yet. I mean, they're, 10, 12 years old. And with the advent of AI, the political discourse of the last 15 years, all the things that they see, and I'm wondering if we will end up splitting Gen Z off just because there's been so much change into Gen Z Part 1 and Gen Z Part 2 or something, just because it seems like that change has been so radical. And I mean, I don't know if there's any prognostication out there about that, but I'm curious, when we're 97 to 2015 is a pretty broad range, and with the amount of change we've had, I wonder if that'll split. I'm not sure. Is there anything out there? Is there any research out there yet to say that these 9-year-olds are that different from the rest of that cohort?
There's not that I know of on Gen Z, but we do tend to look at generations like baby boomers. Sometimes people call younger boomers Generation Jones because they were always trying to keep up with the Joneses, where the older boomers were more concerned about, civil rights and things like that. And the same thing with the millennials. The younger millennials have been called IY, Generation Y, and they're the ones who grew up with technology. So it's very
Okay.
possible that Gen Z, you might separate those that really grew up entering the workplace or finishing school during the pandemic versus those that were little kids.
Interesting.
And
Okay, yeah.
so, but I haven't seen it yet, but it could be out there. Someone may have already done some research on this.
And time will tell, I guess. So
Yeah.
as generations mature, do we see those values and work styles shift? So what we said, are we saying the same thing about Gen X in our 50s as that we said about them, that we would have said about them in the early 80s, the mid 80s to early 90s? Or do we, as we mature, does that population tend to change?
I think as we mature, we do tend to change. Jean Twenge has done a lot of research on
Right.
this. And she says one of the things that really caught my attention was when she talks about the fact that generations overall become more conservative politically and otherwise as they get older. Now, that doesn't mean everyone that had a liberal point of view as they were young are going to become conservative, but they do trend that way as they get older. And there's a lot of reasons that could be. And she goes into in-depth analysis, but her book is called I think that's in her Generations book. I'm looking at my bookshelf. But yeah, she's done a lot of work on that. And yes, we do tend to change as we get older and become a little bit more like those who came before us. It's funny what life will do for you.
Yeah, well, and there's that old saw that if you're not liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart, and if you're not more conservative when you're older, you don't have a brain. I mean, you get more to conserve and hold on to. I know I'm gonna get emails about that, but and definitely I can look back on my thoughts about what the world should be like, what work should be like, and things like that, and how they've changed over, almost 40 years in the workplace. Actually, more than 40, because I got my first job in 5th grade, so 50 years. So I can see that, I wonder what that tells us about, I guess, just leadership having to be pretty dynamic and really pay attention to maybe the Gen Z of today is in 10 years. Forgive me, Gen Zers, maybe they won't be so needy or won't need that affirmation, and maybe they'll feel more independent, and maybe that's because workplaces will respond and give them that independence. But maybe that's what we should talk about is we've got these different generations. The boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z are the primary ones that are in the workplace. Kind of go through the high level differences between what, we'd just pick one, whether it's what they expect from, let's talk about what they expect from leadership and what meaningful work means to each of those and how those would be different. Because I think by the way, her book's great, and she's got on her website, a great cheat sheet. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes that you can download this great PDF that Shawn has on her website. But kind of just go through maybe leadership, what they expect from leadership and what meaningful work. Because I'm always concerned about making sure the work that people are doing is meaningful to them, so that it's more than just going and punching a clock.
Yeah. Well, to start off with, I would say that every generation does want meaningful work. They just look at it differently.
Hmm.
For example, traditionalists would look at meaningful work as for the greater good. They grew up in a world rebuilding after World War II. They still tend to think about, is this for the greater good? Think outside themselves, kind of a responsibility focus, like we're responsible for everyone around us. Boomers might think of meaningful work as something that helps them in their career, helps them in their growth, helps them achieve their personal goals, or helps them at this point maybe become better mentors. Meaningful work might mean mentoring others and bringing people with them on their journey. As they get older, they tend to want to leave a legacy. So that might be more meaningful work to them. Gen X, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think, Gen X like work that's balanced and pragmatic and practical and makes sense to them. They're very, as a generation, very practical. And the millennials like work that's collaborative, that has purpose. They're the first generation to say, what's my purpose? I have to have a purpose at work. And a lot of that came out of the way they were raised, that they were special, that you have a special purpose, a special meaning. Some of the older generations didn't really get that message growing up. And then Gen Z, they want to be authentic. They want work to be flexible. They want to, be adaptable. They're very entrepreneurial in their work. So when you think about things that work well for them, you might think about giving them some autonomy and allowing them to discover things. At the same time, their work's going to be more meaningful to them if they get this constant feedback loop that they're used to from social media and things like that to make sure they're on the right track. Where some of the older generations would just assume, unless no news is good news, right?
Hmm.
When you get to the younger generations, even though they like that meaningful work, they want to connect to the bigger vision and they want to know that they're on track to get there. They want that reassurance.
And I wonder if it's just a factor of being young means you're naturally impatient, because certainly I was when I was early in my career. But it does seem like the younger generation, especially Gen Z, is less comfortable putting in their time
Hmm.
to advance. That they want more rapid, they want acceleration in their career, want to move ahead at a faster pace. And that's just my impression. Is that
Yes.
really characteristic to them, or is that all of us when we're young?
I think we're all a little impatient when we're young, but the expectations, once again, at least when I came to work, was that you paid your dues. And, I remember hearing, like you, I grew up with grandparents and great grandparents, and it was good things come to those who wait, right?
Hmm. Right.
And millennials and Gen Z in particular grew up with good things come to you second day air from Amazon. So,
Yeah.
yeah, fast is good, slow is bad. That's the world they grew up in. That's the message they received from everything going on around them, was that everything had to be faster. And we as a society were expecting things to happen faster as technology increased. Think about it, where we used to wait for things more, even all of us, every age group got used to things moving along faster. And so that's the world they grew up in. They never grew up in the world where people said, good things come to those who wait, the early bird gets the worm. That was not the world they grew up in.
So the title of your book is Strategies for Generational Inclusion at Work. And that term inclusion, like everything with diversity, equity, inclusion, has become a loaded term and it means different things to different people. So when you're talking about generational inclusion, what does that mean? Let's get that really clear for everybody.
Sure. Yeah, it means the seamless blending of the wisdom of experience with the young ideology and the new perspectives of younger generations. I'd been in leadership development quite a few years when I kind of took this pivot into talking about generations. And the reason I was so inspired to do it was because I saw companies, especially larger corporations, pushing people out. By the time they were 60, they wanted to just put that person in a corner office and start encouraging them to retire. And I thought, how short-sighted, because these are people that intuitively know things that you can't learn in school and you can't Google it.
Right.
You know it because you've learned it through experience. And at the same time, I was hearing my younger nieces, nephews, my children and their friends, younger people in my leadership development classes saying, no one listens to us. We got all this education and we're excited about our new job. And we try to share good ideas and we're just shot down immediately. No one wants to hear what we have to say. So why did they hire us? Why are we here? And that's how I got into the discussion of inclusion. I know it's a hot topic, or has been. Things are shifting a little bit, right, in the DEI space,
Mm-hmm.
but has been a hot topic. But what happens is when you have people that don't feel like they belong because of age, which is something we cannot help, among other
Right.
things, we cannot help how old we are. That's how old we are. And there's no sense of belonging. We feel unappreciated. Well, that's why we used to have conversations about quiet quitting,
Mm-hmm.
disengagement, because when you feel like you're not important and it's something you can't control, what do? You have to have a paycheck. So you just kind of go through the motions.
Yeah. And you're not in some very low employee engagement. You're not
Hmm.
contributing to the team. The team doesn't have that cohesiveness to really solve problems and to move ahead. So we recognize these differences, and that's interesting. But how can an employer leverage the knowledge that that we have about these generations to create a more inclusive and ultimately the key goal is a more productive workforce?
Yeah, I think that's very important. Thanks for asking that. And it's a cultural shift, and it has to come from the top down, top leadership down, because you have to have a positive climate where everyone is respected. I heard a story last week from an executive VP in a corporation say he was in a meeting with younger leaders and he felt like every time he said something, they looked at him like, you're old, you're grumpy, and you don't know anything. And we got better ideas. And yeah, just like go sit in the corner.
Mm.
And that's not helpful. And that's coming from the top levels of that corporation, that they're not setting a tone for respecting across the board. At the same time, younger ideas should be respected too. And then there should be a safe, positive environment where we can discuss and have those ideas and those differences collide in a positive way, because what that does is expand options. We start having conversations about things that we would have never thought of if we were busy shutting each other down or staying in our little silo of thought. So it's a top-down cultural shift to look at our differences as opportunities rather than problems.
And that's interesting because as I crest the bell curve of age groups and start to go down on the other side in my volunteer activities, my board activities, and in my own company, sometimes I'll hear an idea and my first reaction will be, yeah, we tried that.
Yes.
Or yeah, that won't work because we've done this, rather than hearing the idea out. So definitely there's something on, I think, with the higher experienced people, because maybe we did try it and maybe it didn't work, but maybe it didn't work because of the people that were trying it or the technology
Mhm.
available or the circumstances. And maybe a different perspective could make this thing happen. And maybe we need to stop and hear these ideas from young people. But on the flip side, I would say that, maybe the young people need to say, okay, you did try that. Tell me about what happened there. Maybe we can learn
Mhm.
from that too and flip that conversation, and take some of the initiative to not shut down that idea, that this won't work, but understand why maybe it didn't before and how do we plan against that into the future.
That's absolutely the right thing to do. Yeah, and me being older too, there are times that there are conversations that I get from younger people where I'm like, "Oh, no, 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 please." But if we can take a step back, hear each other out, and then really talk through it without feeling threatened. No one should feel threatened. It doesn't have to be my idea, your idea. Once again, that's kind of a mind shift, right?
Right.
Because it's hard sometimes to hear that we're wrong or we don't know what we're talking about. But those are the important conversations where we can really leverage the older experience, the younger, bright, fresh perspectives, and come up with possibilities that we wouldn't otherwise. But it is important, and I think this came up in this conversation with this executive, is that he was watching things happen that had failed in the past. And it just seemed like, the whole group was running in the wrong direction, going to make the same mistakes, and they didn't want to hear about what happened in the past. So it is that balance between, let's listen to what's worked in the past, and then let's also listen to how we might change that a little bit and avoid some of the mistakes, and come up with a better way to do things, better way to approach things.
Well, that sounds like a perfect place to end it. But thank you for joining me today, Shawn. That was great.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed being here, Mike.
And you can reach Shawn at ShawnJohnsonSpeaks.com. The link is
Shawn.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Shawn at ShawnJohnsonSpeaks.com.
Oh, yeah. Shawn at ShawnJohnsonSpeaks.com, or you can go to her website, ShawnJohnsonSpeaks.com, and we will include all those contacts in the show notes. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please write us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen, and then share this episode with your favorite social media platform. It really does help us reach more listeners. And we'd love to hear your thoughts at goodmorninghr.com. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.